So I think Doug is going to show a video now from our friends at Scholastic, and then we're going to ask Dana to pop on so I can say some things about Scholastic for a couple minutes, and then we're going to move right into our hybrid logistics conversation. And I think we also have some of our later panelists already on, so maybe they'll join and make comments and be, the smart people that they are. Okay, go ahead, Doug.
Scholastic Literacy Pro is a blended reading solution that provides educators a single tool to monitor student reading activity, comprehension, and progress. With 3 built-in assessments evaluating students' reading readiness, reading level, and comprehension, Literacy Pro provides real-time data and robust reports to help inform instruction in a meaningful way.
Welcome to Literacy Pro. First, you'll identify lowercase letters.
For emerging readers, the Scholastic Reading Readiness Assessment determines mastery of foundational skills. It informs teachers about their early learners' reading abilities across alphabet recognition, phonemic awareness, syllabication, blending, and decoding. The results from Scholastic Reading Readiness will help teachers determine which students may need additional support in selecting independent reading books. For students who have already mastered foundational reading, Literacy Pro includes the Scholastic Reading Measure, which provides a valid and reliable Lexile measure. In this adaptive assessment, students are asked to read passages and answer text-based multiple choice questions that show comprehension. Teachers can assign the Scholastic Reading Measure multiple times a year to monitor progress. At the end of the reading measure, students see their Lexile, and educators can see a roll-up of all their students' Lexiles as well as their growth over time. Literacy Pro also allows teachers to track both guided reading and Lexile levels for every student, supporting either instructional approach. Teachers can always use the data provided to confer with students and communicate with families about their child's progress. The final assessment in Literacy Pro are Think More comprehension checks. Think Mores are text-based quizzes that students complete after they read any ebook or the thousands of paperback books that have connections within Literacy Pro. Think Mores for Spanish language books are available in Spanish as well. During a Think More quiz, students are encouraged to return to the text for evidence. They can view their answers and misconceptions immediately and choose to retake the quiz with a different set of questions. Think Mores provide valuable insight into whether students are comprehending what they read and provide detailed data on 10 higher-order thinking skills. Teachers can view every single question the student answered along with their misconceptions. Scholastic Literacy Pro's assessments were designed with the student in mind, while providing educators essential, authentic data to better inform their daily instruction.
Okay, so we're back. This is LeiLani Cauthen, your host from the Learning Council News, Media, and Research Organization. I have just a couple minutes here to get started now on our Everything Changed conversation about using space and time today and hybrid logistics best practices. I want to do a quick check if our guest from Scholastic is on with us, if Dana is here, if we can unmute her and have her share. Okay, so I guess she's not here. So I just want to say a couple things about Scholastic as a sponsor. We did a full review of a bunch of their software packages. And as you can see from the video, they go pretty deep into actually being able to personalize the learning, a little bit like what Nicole was talking about, and also Safari Montage. This has a lot of attention from learning research because one of the things we know is happening out in the national market space is an attrition of students being lost to alternatives of all kinds, especially homeschooling right now. And so the need to actually get to full personalization is what is being offered by outside organizations, and it's what we have attention on. Traditional public schools really getting to understand and start to apply with professional grade tools, because that makes them more competitive and it helps save public education from more loss. So that's where we have our attention. So right now I'm going to get into this conversation, and hopefully you join me with your comments about, what's happening for your particular schools and districts. Raise your hand. Let's have this whole conversation. You can take a break at any time, by the way. Keep your browser tab tab open. And again, raise your hand, ask questions, make comments. These are all our sponsors for this event today and tomorrow. You'll hear from some of them also later on. This is the overall agenda we're on today. We're running a little bit early, which is great. So I'm going to be talking about how everything changed and using space and time today. And what do we mean by hybrid logistics? This is the research breakthrough that the Learning Council and all of our EduJedi Leadership Society have been talking about for about a year now. And it really accelerated during the pandemic. We were fielding tons of calls from all over the nation asking for next steps. Where's the future going? What do we really need to look like going forward? So we did already hear from these individuals. I'm going to swoop on by that. Let's talk about hybrid logistics. So really, when we talk about hybrid logistics, what we're talking about is the shift in expectations from the national public. What happened when the pandemic hit? What is the shift in time and space use? Meaning, how do you set your pacing guides? How do you manage a schedule when you're riding a roller coaster of are we in, are we out, are we in another lockdown, what's happening? And you've got some families who are just, they're happy with having been remote, and now they're going to be, asynchronous, and your teacher's going to be teaching simultaneously most of the time. And so what are those new principles of hybrid logistics? What does this really look like? So first of all, we knew in the pandemic that many parents were frustrated with how remote learning was being done in a lot of places, because it was literally just moving what you were doing in the traditional public space of classrooms and bells ringing and kids in grades and classrooms, and you moved it all online with Teams or Zoom or whatever sort of video conferencing. That wasn't working in a lot of places, and the horror stories keep coming out about that. So we still have a lot of parents that are still afraid. The vaccine's been a slow moving thing. And so now you have some parents who are like, I really don't want to come back. And some of those are the ones that I just mentioned, that they loved the experience of more home time, and they really want an altered structure now. And that's where a lot of attention from the Learning Council has been. Like, what did the consciousness do? And then you have the other parents who just really want normal back, and they just want to go back to school. But it's the ones that experienced consumer grade learning, exterior to traditional public education with a virtual experience that they liked, that is really the cause of so many superintendents and leaders, administrators of all kinds, telling the Learning Council for the last 8 months, normal's probably not coming back. So what does the future really look like? That's what we're here to talk about today. So this is where we were in 2019. We were at 27% of the American public leaving traditional public education, which means, the typical school building, classes, grade structure. We were at about 11% in homeschool. A lot of those numbers were not well known nationally because of the way they're tracked. There's quite a few states that don't track homeschooling. They just let you homeschool. You don't have to report in anywhere. And then you've got private schools and then the charter schools, which are still public, but they're an alternate route in public. So in 2020, the defection increased by about 3.6% per district to any additional alternative, putting us up at 33.6% now that's opted out. We have crossed the chasm of change, and our prediction as Learning Council is that change is going to continue at a slower pace now than it did in 2020 and now in 2021, but you're going to see continued mutation of structure, like how you're executing and the delivery mechanism. So like Dr. Bell was telling us this morning, they have a lot of teachers that are simultaneous teaching. This is a huge mutation in the teaching parameters, and it will have an effect going forward in terms of refining down what works. You're going to hear a lot of chatter all year long, probably going into next year, about things that didn't work, things that worked, new sort of bullet points of like, here's what you need to do to be successful doing this. You also had a lot of districts that are experiencing well above 3.6%. We know Dallas was with us, Dallas ISD. They were at 13,000 kids, which is close to 15% of their students had left, but The reason we're so conservative at 3.6% is because a lot of the biggest districts that we talked to who had huge losses during the pandemic of kids who went to any alternative is because they are thinking that they're going to win a lot of them back. So we're right now adjudicating a number lower than this actual numbers we saw. And that's because we do believe that maybe it's a lot of those kids are coming back. It was sort of temporary. Maybe the vaccine will ameliorate that and we'll see kids coming back. But you also had a lot of stories from a ton of districts about they'd have enrolled kids, maybe high schoolers who were also having to babysit younger kids at home, and they weren't showing up online. So there's also that other percentage of kids that were enrolled, still aligned with the traditional public, but they weren't showing up, and there was massive loss of achievement across all grades. The number one percentage of kids out was actually kindergarten through second grade. They weren't showing up at a rate that was almost 3 times what the older kids were doing, almost across the board nationally. So there's a lot of attention from districts on the youngest set of kids, getting them caught up, following through with trying to, match where they're supposed to be at in terms of achievement and that kind of thing. So let's just talk about this space and time revision that is going on and what it really means for your school or district going forward. So first of all, in terms of space, you have a sectioning of buildings going on, sometimes by entrance. That's wise, probably all the way through 2021. We don't know if there's been a mutation of COVID. We're hearing signs of that. And so we're probably going to have PPE through the year and be on high alert at least through 2021. So you will still have a lot of behavior from schools of being sort of cautious all year long. We also have been hearing from a lot of schools that they're alternating business or building use by groups. So maybe they have group A in these grades and group B. That's also a wise move, but it really messes with how you schedule. So suddenly the typical lesson planning, the typical pacing guide being plotted onto the calendar is kind of haywire. And we think technology is coming to fix that, because that is one of the big pain points for schools and districts. Then you also have maybe schools are moving to house rooms. So they've got a lot of kids that are distance learning. So they sign them into sort of a homeroom in case that day parents are having to do something and grandma can't watch them. So they're technically a remote kid, but they're in building that day and they're sort of quarantined off in a certain area for whatever reason. So you have this house room mentality appearing, where classrooms then are meeting space only and the child is moved into the classroom only if needed because there's a class that day. That's happening mostly in high schools, a little bit in middle school. There's also, of course, there's all the social distancing that's happening, kids having to be remote. There's this new micro school idea. Some of the bigger schools, school districts have taken local unused retail space and made them into micro schools, which parents really don't want to go away. They like it. They don't have to go as far to school. There's a smaller group of kids there. They feel safer. So the whole idea that we've been going forward with for the last 10, 20 years has been consolidate. Now you're having a sway back the other way, which is to micro school or do pandemics. I'm holding on, just somebody's giving me a note. Okay. So then you have parents over development, which is a new occurrence. And I think that all the dimensions that school districts are looking at right now, like Dr. Bell talked about doing a survey of all the parents, there's a lot of parents in California, where I'm at, that had to develop pods because maybe they had parents that were working. So they just put together a little neighborhood group and they kind of like it. They're sharing who's overseeing the kids, and they really don't want to go back to school because they like this pod. Somebody's converted garage in the neighborhood and all the kids go there every day. And they really don't want to go back to school. So those micro schooling and pods is a trend. And it's very interesting what that trend's going to do to traditional public in terms of space use and whether or not they have, teachers that are rotating out to check on those kids, that kind of thing. All right, so let's talk about time for a second. I know this is an interesting conversation. Learning Council talking to you about space and time. It almost sounds like Star Trek, and we are the Edu Jedi Leadership Society as well, so it makes sense. But in time, you've got the traditional schedules now with or without video conferencing for remote or hybrid. Maybe you're using Teams, maybe you're using Zoom, maybe you're using Google. But the traditional schedules are getting messed with. And that could still happen throughout 2021, where suddenly it's a shutdown. And since your pacing guides were already plotted on the calendar, you have a cascading change for every teacher, for every lesson plan. And that is very messy. And it causes people to get gray hair really quickly. That is being talked about by a lot of the teaching level. Like it's very disorienting for them. And then you also have those rotation schedules still happening where you have AB days or AB weeks. So you're affecting how you're using time from a very complex sort of algorithmic who gets what when and who's teaching what when. There's not a lot of software programs in the field right now that are managing that space and time use being so different than it was before. You also have schools that are staggering their starts. So they're only, like when we went back to school, they were staggering starts for who was in building, who was not in building. You also have wildly altered daily block schedules. So some are going to shorter blocks, some are going to much longer blocks. We looked at a ton of those schedules coming out in August, September timeframe, where you get a large block of time. And if you didn't tell your teachers, like, we don't want you to be on a Zoom call that whole hour and a half, you're just supposed to be on there for 20 minutes and the rest is asynchronous, then, students were blowing up because they couldn't sit still that long. So those daily block schedules, another mutation of use of time. And then you've got this new thing emerging, which Scholastic, the video that we just showed you, embedded in some of their programs is the concept of auto cohorting students and then calendaring them based on their pace. So that means right now, in the way that Scholastic does it, and we think this is going to blow up to sort of an enterprise-wide trend, you have teacher able to take existing class, so already a group, and auto cohort students based on their pace so that they can pay attention to the students who are moving slower or ones that are stuck on one particular concept, and then take their fastest ones and ungate them in the system and let them zoom ahead or give them other materials so they're not bored. That concept is something that, consumer grade software, the gaming industry, their modularization has been doing for a really long time. It is now very clearly a consumer expectation that has landed heavily in the traditional public education world. And a lot of leadership is grappling with, how do we truly personalize? How do we make it so that the student feels like they can zoom ahead in math if they're a mathlete, right? They're super fun at math, but then they're getting custom attention in other subjects where they're maybe slower. So the unwhole grouping, the moving away from whole group conceptualization on everything is a big trend in 2021. And then again, it goes back to that consumer grade stuff and the fact that we've altered space and we've altered time. So if you see all those things sort of coming together, that's really what I'm talking to you about today, is that particular concept of what's really changed going forward. You also have another trend, we didn't put that on the slide, but there's a fracturing in the market in terms of which main platforms you're using, Google, is it Microsoft, which social media you're using, where. All those things are changing a lot. I'm going to just check my chat here for a second. Okay. So make sure you chat and make comments. I'd love to hear your ideas about what I'm saying. Like if you say, oh, I have an example of that, of what she's saying right now in my mind, just please pop that on, because we really want to have a dialogue. We don't just want to be me, a talking head all day. So all right, so here's what's really happening, and I brought this up a little bit with Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. The impact on teachers of this shifting space and time issue. is that sometimes they can teach from home via video conferencing and systems, and you might need to do that again. Like I said, 2021 could be just as much of a roller coaster ride as 2020 was. And then you have them being in the classroom, maybe sometimes now because you're A/B grouping, and maybe they're not there one day and they're there another day. Depends on what level, the upper grades might be doing this more than middle school and primary. And then you've moved to classes on campus with kids maybe in homerooms most of the time and flighted out to classrooms when the class is called, only socially distanced, the rest of the kids but via Zoom, that kind of thing. You also have a lot of districts talking about frontline and backline teaching. And the reason for that is they're trying to drive at more personalization, or they're desperately trying to get ahead of the curve to plan out lesson plans as the sort of shifting schedule changes. So that frontline and backline allows the backline to lay the bricks of all the lesson plans down, and then the frontline is actually executing on the teaching. And behind them is a bunch of people that are helping, lay all those lesson bricks, so to speak. That's a different concept than we've had in the past, and it's working really great. I know it's mostly East Coast districts that have talked about this the most. And then also maybe assigning some teachers out to those mini schools and be roving to visit the parents over development local pods. That's a new concept too. We've always had special needs teachers doing that for many years. They've sort of been rovers because no district could really afford all the ones they needed. So they hired one, and that poor special needs teacher was putting 400 miles a week on their, or even a day on their car to go from school to school to school to manage the special needs lessons that were needed. Now that could be any subject, could be all subjects, or maybe assigned by geography. And you also have direct instruction on demand online, which is also a new model. One of the hottest technologies of interest from our national survey was chat bots and on-demand windows for kids to use, and use them 24 hours. That's a totally new service model for schools to think about, but that technology is hot right now. It actually was like the third highest one of our entire survey, which we were totally not expecting that to be such a hot technology this year. All right, so there's also a lot of new attitudes about what you want to do with your teachers right now. So this is from our good friend Kurt Madden, who's a chief technology officer from Fresno Unified. We've been friends for a really long time. He basically came out and said right after the pandemic started, we don't have a captive audience anymore, which is why I talked to you about the attrition to alternatives. You have to have an attitude now as a school or district leader that what you're looking at is not guaranteed. You don't have a guaranteed number of students enrolling every year. The wave of change that happened so far during the pandemic was real. And once you hit a certain threshold, there's normally sort of a snowballing effect out in the public where parents are talking to other parents. This is working better for me. And you do have in some districts already in the nation where kids are just opting out mid the school year. And so if you start treating what you're doing as you don't necessarily have a captive audience, it changes behavior across all of your administration and all of your teachers. So Kurt also said that a teacher is now more of just a coach or a mentor, which is a wise way to start looking at what you want teachers to do. Everything that ClassLink was just showing you, Safari was showing you, the Scholastic software, all the different companies we've been working with, they're showing you what it's like to stand alongside content and manage it and say, okay, these kids are moving, those kids are not. This one is not making progress. I got to swoop in as a teacher and coach them through. It's not the same thing as having an attitude of a teacher of like, I'm the source of the knowledge. These are just widgets over here. And I'm going to lecture and lecture and lecture. And I'm going to be the person handing out each individual Google Doc or whatever. Actually leaning hard on what the technology is doing for you is the real shift that happened in 2020. And that's going to accelerate. It's going to start refining. You're going to see a lot like what Dr. Bell was saying. You're going to see people saying, I'm discarding this particular program because I already have 6 other ones and it's too much money. I'm going to rearrange how I'm spending money because I also want this program over here that I don't have yet. That's going to happen a lot in 2021. So the way they looked at curriculum in Fresno was it has to be designed to work and shift to all 3 environments all the time. And this is a major theme that you should be thinking with for 2021. You should be traditional with PPE, masks, social distancing, all that stuff. You should be willing to have blended campus with remote learning, maybe teachers simultaneously teaching. Maybe you have a frontline and backline. And then chatbot and online, but it's all one unit. And kids are just asking about how they're delivered to based on which classes, not whether or not they're remote. I hope that's understandable. So instead of standing up a separate, fully online, these are the online kids and they're over there and they're separate, it's all blended together. And then maybe you do have distance learning only, where they literally don't have to be on campus at all. Now, in some places that's hard because you're supposed to have them on campus for a certain number of hours just to count them as enrolled. That's going to be a fight in a lot of places that'll go on this year. All right, so another truth that we want to make sure everyone understands is that the largest research study that we've ever seen, it was in 2017, was by this Association for Psychological Science. They analyzed data measuring screen time and well-being collected from 120,000 15-year-olds. It was the largest study we've ever seen. So there's really no disputing the study because it's just so large. The optimum they found for screen learning, and I'm going to qualify what I mean by that, is 4.5 hours per day is good for teen brain. If you exceed that, it starts to be not good for teen brains, which is really an interesting thing. So that you can see the full study on there. That 257 minutes is a sweet spot. So what we tell schools you have to think with is try not to go past about 2.5 hours of the day used by the school for intensive screen learning, which is teacher, student in a Zoom or Teams meeting. So you have to take that 2.5 hours and try to slice it up in your school day across all your teachers for that one student. So that might mean they each get 20 minutes to do that kind of live interaction, and all the rest should be other learning, hands-on, or screen learning that's not that intensive, but it's an actual program that the student's individually working through. It still sort of qualifies as screen learning to do that, but it's not the same as that intensive, like I got to pay attention to the teacher right now, and I'm supposed to be involved in dialogue with all these other kids at the same time. So 2.5 hours is leaving 2 hours for personal screen use, which is maybe something you want to infringe on, maybe you shouldn't infringe on. It's your decision as a district. But we also say that 60% of the time obviously should be project-based. That might be a digital project, right? It might be, sort of manipulating something on the screen, clicking through things, playing a game, but it's still sort of a project. And then whole group, which would include sort of like maybe some video conferencing, but it's like a project everyone's working on. They're editing something together, they're writing something together, but it's not, I'm listening to somebody and I have to take notes. So, and small group or direct instruction. Hopefully that's clarified for you. So we're interested in schools sort of adopting this 40-60 learning ratio. Intensive screen learning is a smaller amount of time, and the rest is sort of amorphously project-based or independent study where you're doing your reading or you're doing your essays. That can be separate sort of screen learning, but the intensive time is of concern. And you're going to see across 2021, more teachers or more schools being caught out by their parents are like, my kid's on the screen all day long. There's that whole thing, parents are concerned about screen time. I'm going to ask my associate to make sure we're checking questions. You guys want to make comments, Okay, so we're doing that. All right. Okay, good. All right. So the big questions for K-12 right now, and I've sort of outlined this for you, is where is space and time and your people, where is the direction going? What are we looking at as sort of an evolutionary pattern across 2021? And what about the workflow of all this? You heard me bring up with Nicole a little bit about the traffic pattern. So in our experience, the early schools coming into the fray, one of the first things that happens with them is teachers realize that the traffic pattern in digital is a bit more than it was in the physical classroom where they were handing out paper or they were using textbooks. So when you're live in front of 30 kids and you pass out paper, you normally pass it to the kids in the front row and they pass it back behind them to the rest of the kids. It's easy. And then you collect the papers. They all arrive on your desk when kids come back in with their assignments. And it's an easy traffic pattern. Now in digital, you're in the situation where maybe you have to email every single, click the class and then everybody gets the same message. But then what hits you is the traffic coming back from them individually. And then you're trying to personalize, like, hey, Johnny, what happened with you for each kid? If you're in, primary, you might have multiple subjects. So now you're doing that traffic pattern for all the kids on every distribution of resource. Even though they might be already assigned something in your single sign-on, you still have to give them their directions for the day with the lesson plan. So now if you're not really watching it, what you end up with is a huge volume of traffic on your teachers. If they're also finding lesson resources in overly nested systems, which means too many folders, it's really confusing, and you're not using something like Safari, they're going here, they're going there, they're checking this system, they're checking that system over there, and they're also custom building every lesson sequence, like go log in here, then do this here, now we're going to have a discussion, now you're going to take a test. If they're doing that with all the kids on every subject, it's a traffic nightmare. So that's what we're dealing with here, is the complexity that technology is actually bringing in terms of traffic. It's also taking workload off. We can't forget that. Technology is great, but there is a change in the traffic pattern when we move to digital. So we're bringing that up with you. So you start paying attention to it this year. So here's where we're at with changing the basic organizing principle. This is what's happening right now in the United States. I have to take a drink of coffee. Wet my whistle. Okay. So you have the whole group, classes, grade, courses. Those are pyramid bureaucracies. And that's the structure we've been in for, 150, 200 years. Now we're in the middle of moving towards attempting to individualize and deliver learning through tech. Because once you're fully in the tech mainstream and you're teaching some of the kids remote, you have to now execute in the same platform with the kids that are alive in front of you. And so they have devices, the other kids have devices. We're in a mutation now where the traffic pattern again of the resource, the message, when we're going to lecture, now we got question and answer happening with some of the kids, and maybe those question and answer comes in after hour. Who's going to answer that? You have complexity in this mutation. What we want you to understand is where we think it's going from all the research that we've seen and observing what's going on in the consumer markets for software, is that it really is moving towards individualizing learning. That sounds like a mountain too high to climb for most school districts who are used to the pyramid structure, the class structure. They push down planning standards, and then at the teacher level, everything fractures into everything the teacher wants to do rather than they have a plan and it goes direct to the student, and the teachers are servicing that structure on the side. So they're not actually just being the source of everything. They're serving an ongoing pattern. That is happening because you can't really get to fully individualized learning if you retain the whole group structure indefinitely. It has to mutate like it is mutating right now. So what we're saying is at some point you have to start embracing a structural shift. And what does that mean? So that you don't lose the teacher-human interaction that is so important. And so that's why this is sort of a rough moment. So it looks like more like individualized learning, a distributed service model, And also what we now call the extraliminal network organization is real. What I mean by extraliminal is there's a lot of districts out there, maybe they can't get a science teacher. They're out in the hinterland. So they go to a district neighboring, maybe one of the large ones in the metro areas, and said, you have a teacher that maybe isn't full time. Can we use part of their time? So that extraliminal sort of gig economy of teachers is emerging. And part of the reason it's emerging is because we have a teacher shortage. We had massive loss of teachers during the pandemic, and it is continuing with some of the older crowd teachers who are like, I'm just going to retire early because maybe I have many allergies, I can't get the vaccine, so I'm just going to go. That's still happening. So what I'm saying here is that we're moving towards something we call algorithmic live teaching intersection. So the live teaching point, the direct instruction, is determined by all the statistics and the data that is hitting the administration saying we now to trigger this classroom moment. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. Okay, so I already talked a little bit about the problem. I want to show you this graphic. What's happening with the problem in teaching right now, and you're going to witness this more and more over the course of 2021, so we're pointing it out early for you so you can start thinking about it, is that live teaching plus virtual teaching ends up with this scenario where you're distributing and collecting assignments. Maybe you're doing it via email, maybe you're doing it during Teams, maybe it's within some sort of other structure where they're pre-assigned resources, but it's a lot of traffic. Okay, so I've just been alerted that I have a question in chat, so I'm going to check my chat window here. Okay, so can we unmute Steve Goodfriend? I'm asking my associate to unmute you, Steve, so you can ask your question directly. I think I'm going to go back to the earlier slide while we unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of new vocabulary that I'm hearing in this presentation. So I am thinking about the concept of adaptive learning, and that being as a trend in education for students to be learning at their pace, at their level, and at their pace. Yeah. So is that really what we're is that the same thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, and I think I want to clarify what adaptive digital learning is in its original definition, because remember the Scholastic video? I don't know if you're on for when we showed the Scholastic video. Most definition right now, the early definition of adaptive digital curriculum is it's a maybe subject specific standalone application that within itself is distributing the contextualized knowledge, maybe with animation or whatever. Student works their way through it, absorbing the content, getting pelted with questions, and then as they get through that, they're gated forward to the next level like a game. It's adaptive in that if they can't pass the question, they get pelted with more information or clarity, or the system alerts the teacher to come over there and fix that kid with direct instructions so they understand. That's adaptive digital curriculum right now. So you have companies like ST Math Mind Research, Dreambox, IXL Learning, a lot of the Scholastic software. This stuff is adaptive in that definition. Does that make sense? But it's not necessarily an enterprise-wide application of the word adaptive digital yet. That's what I'm getting to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Steve, because what we're talking about here is this concept of maybe don't try to take your old pyramid bureaucracy and shove it all into adaptive digital. That would be like mapping subject adaptive digital curriculum across your pacing guide, and everybody has to log in all these different systems all the time only. The problem with it is that all of it is built, pretty much all of it, not all of it, to have some intersection with the teachers, but your teachers would riot because they want more live teaching. So how do you bring those two things together is what we've been grappling with as Learning Council. How do you not give up entirely the old world, but use a lot of this other stuff? And the second question is, how do you not try to only be competency-based? See, the online world mostly went to trying to do competency-based pathways, okay? Once you pass this module, then you're moving forward only. That's not going to work for a lot of schools. From a resource perspective and how much heavy lifting you'd have to do to make sure everybody hit every competency, it's just not realistic. So I'm trying to have you conceptualize that we're divorcing the concept of competency-based only from where the future is going, because we don't really believe it can do that. We believe that there can be a nicer blend, a more personalized blend of live with digital. And that hasn't fully emerged yet, but it's coming from all the things we've been looking at in terms of the advancement of technology that's coming. I'm really proud of Microsoft and Google for some of the work they've done, for Safari, what they've done, et cetera. So looking at the initial problem we have to overcome is, in order to get to this more cleanly executed intersection of, live teaching and digital, the first thing we have to overcome, and you're going to see a lot of work on this in 2021, is this problem of traffic. This is partly a structural problem, because when you move to digital, suddenly your bottleneck is the teacher. The teacher has to do things in terms of distributing and collecting in a digital realm that are almost fairly manual. You get this, now you get this, okay, click this resource, put that over there, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of work in it, a different type of work than you had when you were paper-based and all the kids were in front of you. And it's not a recognized workload very much by too many administrators. So you have to go watch how this goes on, and then light bulb goes off. You're like, holy cow. It's like 30 messages to us. Yeah, maybe it's a one click for distribution the first time, but then all of it comes back at you with assignments, right? And now you got to do all the things individually. And maybe a little bit of that's automated, depends on the program, or depends on if what you're distributing is a piece of the lesson that is just a chunk of content. We call it discrete digital content, like it's a scanned in old piece of something, or a paragraph or a website. Go here, come back, let's do this. That's a different type of traffic than what's in what was called the adaptive digital curriculum, because that maybe have its own dashboard. That dashboard's not connected to your top level dashboard. Maybe you can only see in ClassLink the amount of traffic in the system, but inside the system is a different set of dashboard. So you've got traffic there as well. And then when you're managing all of your individual communications to try to personalize for every kid, very different than a live classroom only, right? Like they're in front of you. They raise a hand, you answer right there, and all the other kids learn the same thing. Now they're all somewhere else, or maybe some of them are in front of you and some of them are somewhere else, and you're getting pelted with traffic from different directions, and you're having to answer an individual email, individual text inside Teams or whatever. It's a lot of traffic. So this is what we're pointing out is the issue, the first biggest barrier you hit as you try to go fully digital. It's a structural barrier of the teacher being that place of all of this. So what you're going to see start to happen is a lot of schools and districts are going to see what they can take off this. They're going to look at this burden and they're going to say, how can we make this less? Is there something we can pull up that becomes universal? And the first thing they'll do is standardize resources. All sixth grade uses this math and only this math. So that's the mutation that we see happening right now. Okay, so I got more to take you guys through real quick. I got 5 more minutes here. So this is just a graphic to show you the burden on the teacher versus when you go to a student-centric model, which is what we think is emerging for all the reasons I've been talking about. The fully digital transition unburdens teachers from having to do everything for every individual student. They get turned into a service structure to manage direct instruction and human interface, which is more important. It's what they're there for. They are human. Let's use them for being humans. So I'm not going to go too deep into that, but the reason it looks like that is if you're trying to personalize, this is one subject, one class, okay? Across time, here at the top, September, October, these groups of kids, they get these resources represented by yellow. This is one resource allocated, and then there's a different resource here and a different one there. And then the second kid, Isabella, gets these resources based on that student's comprehension level. And then we got maybe like, we can't do every single kid, so we're going to group them in group 1, group 2, group 3. So this isn't even full personalization. But this looks like air traffic control to me. I know some of you guys have heard me say this before. This isn't a human job. So that's where the first big algorithmic inference stuff is going to start happening. All right. So if you were to build a student-centric hybrid, the first thing you would look at is automation of the framework system, a little bit like Dr. Bell talked about. They have an automated framework. I don't know. I have to look at it to see how automated it is. But the next thing you do as a school or district is you plot those standards on the calendar. You group them like standard 2 through 3, week 1, 2, 3, right? And then the teachers look at that calendar and then they build a lesson plan. These things are not cohesive. They don't algorithmically infer to each other. So if you slide your calendar for even a snow day or another COVID shutdown, every teacher has to redo their plans. So an example lesson plan that we see coming out in the future is this part D on this slide, which is maybe step 1 is read something. Step 2 is build a paper model or maybe a digital model of something. Step 3 is you're supposed to be in a live lecture moment now. That moment would be algorithmically inferred. You'd auto cohort your students and trigger that live moment based on number who've reached this point. So the other points are not necessarily competency points. They're not necessarily that. They're just the lesson sequence. Which isn't always based on competency only. And that's the difference between purely adaptive digital curriculum and a hybrid logistics infrastructure. Hybrid logistics doesn't depend on competency. It may encompass competency-based learning within it as one of these resources, but it doesn't depend on it. Okay, so let's say you were to build this plan. Down here, you have a start point. You're doing your reading. You hit the second point, there's a red light for you. Only 3 of you have reached this lecture intersection in your cohort. So you're told, jump over to science or some other subject. So you skip over there, the clock is running. Oh, now the cohort is full. You get an alert as a student. None of this is done by the teacher, by the way. And it triggers the class. Now the teacher gets a pop-up on their calendar. You're going to deliver at 2 o'clock today, lecture 101B, you know the lesson, blah, blah, blah. And they do it maybe both virtually or live or some alternate in between that. On campus or not on campus, doesn't matter. But they set the size of the cohort. They set the trigger points. They accept it as a calendar item. Once it's accepted as a teacher, it triggers to every student that's already in the cohort and starts accruing the next cohort. Again, not necessarily competency-based. Now the student moves through some other parts of their pathway. Virtual reality practice is a little example in this one. They do a math proof, they do a final test, or maybe they don't do a final test. Maybe there's no test in there. It's just a sequence. And they're auto-routed to the next based on the teacher allowing them to auto-route, because you can build in gates in a hybrid logistics infrastructure. So I'm just giving you a vision of the future here really quickly. Like this little kid right here in the middle, the guy in the blue shirt, he's coming in from home. He comes in, he's sent to a robotics lab. He maybe has to read something as well. The first little girl, she goes out to a classroom, then the robotics lab. All of this is being run by real-time management for who's going where, who's doing what. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here in just a second and bring on our good friend Leslie and Jason. This is the new hybrid model architecture. This is the first event we've revealed this. It's different than the ones we've revealed in the past. It shows sort of all of the pieces that will now go into the best-in-class model architecture. You probably have a lot of questions about it, but it will necessarily include a structure to auto-cohort, auto-distribute, auto-calendar to unburden teachers and use teachers at their finest of being humans. We actually played a game of this back at our last actual get-together at a national gathering, where it showed the traffic pattern shift and how space was used. And this game is available for all EduJedi in our EduJedi training. So where we're actually seeing the first designs is Learning Council is doing some of those ourselves. We're hearing companies doing parts of things themselves, but it's a master scheduling, calendaring concept of hybrid logistics. So I'm not going to get too deep into that. Thank you for listening. If there's any other questions, type them in. Let me know. We're going to have some more time at the back end of the day to get more into this alongside what's going on with achievement and motivation.